to take his men down to the valley where God would give him the promised victory. Now, what a sight this must have been to Sisera as these foolish Hebrews left the safety of Mount Tabor to take on his chariot army on ground that would give him almost an insurmountable advantage. This was going to be easy. And it was apparent that his God was giving him the victory over the God of the Hebrews, just like he had over the past 20 years. Sisera has the enemy right where he wants them, so he can mow them down easily over the open plain, like a hot knife through butter, basically. What he doesn't know is that the true and living God has Sisera exactly where he wants him. And to their credit, as they literally step forward in faith, Barak's army has no idea what God is about to do. And just when it seemed that their doom was nearly moments away, boom! The sky opened up, and God sent a thunderstorm of epic proportion onto the battlefield, which then caused a flash flood. The Kishon River, which moments before was only a dry riverbed, suddenly became a torrent that swallowed some chariots whole, while others began to get stuck in the mud in the river as the river overflowed. Stuck and in panic, many of them left their chariots and fled away on foot to Harosheth. Israel chased them down and killed them all. Sisera himself abandoned his own chariot, but he fled in the opposite direction toward the camp of his ally, Heber. When he arrived, Jael, Heber's wife, invited Sisera into her tent to hide. He was now under her protection, which was an ancient code practiced in the Middle East. So after giving him blankets, some warm milk, Jael grabbed a tent peg and a hammer. And once she was sure that he was sound asleep, she drove that tent peg directly into his temple, killing him instantly. Later, Barak enters the camp, and Jael shows him the lifeless body of Sisera. The chapter ends by telling us that after a continued campaign, Israel finally subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan. That's last week. All right. Chapter 5. So, I really wanted to teach Judges. I really did. I was so excited. But I wanted to avoid chapter 5. If I could have taught Judges and just avoided this chapter, I would have. As a matter of fact, I thought of possibly asking Pastor George to take chapter 5 for me. It's been quite an adventure. But as I studied through it and as I worked through the text, I'm blessed and glad to be presenting chapter 5 to you tonight. So I'm glad I am teaching it. But I was a little nervous. Chapter 5, we have the Song of Deborah, and it's a poetic version of the account of chapter 4. It is a victory song, an anthem of God's deliverance of his people. It also includes a summation of what gets them into trouble to begin with, some of the problems that exist. We will also be given some extra details or important hints as to what the spiritual and political situation was during this time in Judges, which is about 150 years in. The difficulty in explaining this chapter is in the fact that it is a song that was written to be memorized and sung. It is full of figurative and flowery language. This chapter has a group of phrases that are so hard to unravel that there is nothing approaching an even close consensus of their meaning or interpretation. So we are going to take this chapter in bite-sized chunks tonight. My hope tonight is that we can get a better idea of what Deborah was meaning to say by looking closely at the text. We'll look at some words. We'll see what their meanings are. We'll look at some phrases closely. And we're going to use what we already know, what we already went over. What do we know about the time of Judges? That'll help us also kind of get through this text. So let's start. And I'm going to begin by reading the first 5 verses of Judges chapter 5. So if you haven't already, turn to Judges chapter 5. Did you have notes? Now, up on the screen, I have a map, just so I can refer to it. I hope you guys can see some of the tribes there. Do you have it? Okay, Judges chapter 5. We're going to read the first 5 verses. They're all good. Okay. Then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, that the elders led in Israel, that the people volunteered, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O rulers, I to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth quaked. The heavens also dripped. Even the clouds dripped water. The mountains quaked at the presence of the Lord, this Sinai at the presence of the Lord, the God of Israel. Now, the first verse indicates that Deborah and Barak sang this song. That does not mean that Barak wrote it too, but only that he got top billing with Deborah, obviously. Other verses will make it clear that Deborah was actually the author and not Barak. So in verse 2, we have our very first challenge. We've just started the very first phrase of verse 2. It says in my NASB, and depending on your whatever you have, it could be very, very different from mine. My NASB says that the leaders led in Israel. And the only one that is like all the others is in Israel. They got that one right. But all the other words are a little different. Now, the King James Version, if you have that at home, says, praise ye the Lord for the avenging of Israel. So, obviously, Israel is the same there. They didn't get that right. But the Hebrew phrase here is, Bifroah paraoth. Bifroah paraoth. Now, this actually, if you take it word for word, could be translated this. When men let grow their hair in Israel. Right? So you see how they struggled with this translation. What does that mean? Now, because this doesn't fit a standard Hebrew idiom, it has been translated a few different ways, but let's go with what we know. Okay, we're going to take the literal translation here. We're going to go with hair, because I think it really is what Deborah was using as a picture here. Hair has always been a symbol of strength and of dedication to God. Okay, even at the time of the judges, same thing. Like Samson and the Nazirite vow. Samson was born under a Nazirite vow, never cut his hair. So Nazirite vows existed at this time and was known. Now, during the time of a Nazirite vow, because of their commitment to God, men did not cut their hair. Added to this was the fact that the Canaanites were said to keep their hair short or even shaven. With, sometimes most of their beards were trimmed. The point is, I think Deborah is praising the men or volunteers who showed up to battle with their hair unkempt, Nazirite style, in a renewed dedication to God. That's the idea here. At the same time, shunning the appearance of the Canaanites, which we talked about as already having too great an influence on them at this point as it is, right? Now, because this is a song, I can't be sure if she meant that they literally showed up with really long hair, or this was merely metaphorical, that they had rededicated themselves in spirit against the Canaanite influence. And I put here, don't modern sports figures leave their hair during a playoff run, right? We've seen this right in our modern day. You have the quarterback or the other player who doesn't shave their beard or their hair until they lose, and when they finally lose and they shave, right? So we kind of have that kind of idea. So I don't know if necessarily they came to the battlefield with their hair unkempt and unshaved, ready to fight Nazirite style, or after the original battle, maybe they didn't shave till Jabin was finally wiped out. And that's what Deborah's referring to. They all decided not to shave until the job was done. Anyway, I like to think of it that way. I don't think we have to change the word-for-word phrasing there. I think it gives us a great picture. So now the last phrase says, bless the Lord. And the meaning here is for Israel to bow down before him in praise and adoration. That's blessing the Lord, and thanking him for what he's done. Now, interesting, this is a song. The word bless is barak, which is spelled like Barak, but with a different vowel at the end. But spoken, they actually almost sound identical. So, Barak the Lord, Barak the Lord. So I wonder if Deborah added that in. So just so you know that. So she concludes verse 2 by calling on all Israel to praise or bless the Lord for being the source of this great victory. Now, in verse 3, Deborah addresses the heathen kings of Jabin and all who were aligned with him. He's not talking about Israel there, because Israel don't have royalty or kings. So this is an address to Jabin and everyone that's aligned with him. They will know that the God of Israel is the one true God and that their gods are false and weak. Now remember that the thinking of the time was that the army that won on the battlefield had the stronger God. So she was introducing them to Jehovah, her God. In verse 3, she will sing a praise to the Lord, and these kings will know who the God of Israel is. Now, in verse 4 and 5, Deborah sings about God's awesome power as sort of this divine warrior who comes out and fights for his people. When the Lord manifests his presence, whenever the Lord has, in every book, every time the Lord manifests his presence, what happens? The earth shakes. Things tend to quake, right? Like mountains and hills. And he brings the rain. That's a modern statement. He brings the rain, but he really does. He brings the rain. David uses some of the same language in Psalm 68, verses 7 and 8. He says, God, when you went forth before your people, when you marched through the desert, Selah, the earth quaked. The heavens also dropped rain at the presence of the Lord. Sinai itself quaked at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Also, during these verses of praise, besides this description of God and how he works and what happens in the physical realm when he shows up for his people, we also have this connection between Sinai and Seir. So the mountains of Seir, that's in the territory of Edom. And if you look below, if you actually go, the Dead Sea is the sea at the very bottom here. And if you go directly below the Dead Sea, that's where Edom is. And the mountain range is Seir. Now, if you continue in a direct line, you're going to get to Sinai. All right? So if you go from Sinai into the Holy Land, or vice versa, Sinai is kind of on the way, Seir is on the way. So I see this as kind of like this connection that God is making and that Deborah is making. Moses mentions both Seir and Sinai in Deuteronomy 33:2. I didn't put that down, but you can look that up later. This connection seems to be more of a directional one, having to do with the wilderness wanderings and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai is said to be located in the direction of Seir. One of the reasons why the traditional site, which we did talk about when we went over the crossing of the Red Sea, remember we talked about in the Sinai Peninsula, that traditional site is that's where Mount Sinai is? That's incorrect. I mean, God states it here. It's in the direction of Mount Seir. It's like in a direct line. So it's not, it's on the other side of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, actually. So I get this picture of our God traversing these mountains with these huge steps as he comes to the aid of his people. And things are quaking and shaking and rain is coming. You know, the earth quaking, the reference to the clouds dripping water, I think was not only speaking about the fearful sight at Sinai, which if you go back to Exodus you read, but also what happened on the battlefield at the Kishon as God sent a violent thunderstorm. I think we get that picture as well. Any questions over the first 5 verses? Okay, verses 6 through 11. I want to talk a little bit about, I want to go off, and we're just going to go off the notes for just a couple minutes. I want to talk a little bit about timing. If you take all of the judges and you stack them up and you don't overlap them at all, the time of the judges becomes way too long. So it's actually impossible that the judges did not in some way overlap. All right, it just works out better that way. So they had to have overlapped. And I just don't know if I've brought this out there, so I want to make sure that we're clear on that as we look at this next section. Let's just go over the judges that we know so far and give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I'll introduce it, and then we'll read, and then I'll go over the section. So Othniel was our first judge. He's listed first. He probably was the first. He was the first one, definitely, right? So after he defeated the doubly wicked Cushite, they had peace in the land for 40 years. Our next judge was Ehud, right? And he went against the king of Eglon. Now, as Ehud has his left hand inside the gut of Eglon, the king, Othniel was probably still alive and judging in Judah. And so there more than likely was an overlap because Ehud was judging and freeing Benjamin and Ephraim, which is like the orange color and the purple there, right in the center of Israel. So there may have been just an overlap of years. Then Benjamin and Ephraim had peace for, do you guys remember how long it was? It's a long one. 80 years. So there was a lot of peace, a extended period of time where Benjamin and Ephraim had peace because they had peace as long as Ehud was alive, and he was alive for 80 years after all the events. So they would have had peace. So that you have that there. Now you have Shamgar, who's the third judge. And Shamgar probably did his thing after the death of Othniel, but during the lifetime of Ehud. So there might have been a little bit of an overlap there. So that Shamgar did his thing, and Ehud was probably still alive. And so I just wanted to make sure that you understood, and I can go over that there is these overlaps that are possibly happen. As long as we don't violate our main rule, that is, for the lifetime of the judge, the Lord was not going to bring an oppressor to that area. So we have overlaps that make sense here. And so I want you to understand that so we can see those things. So let's read. Anybody have any questions about judges, timing? it's very, very hard. You can't go into the book of Judges and say, well, from 1222 to 1187, this judge, and, they can't do that. It's just very difficult to do that. So you can get kind of an idea of some dates, but because of the overlaps, we never really can, date anything. All right, so let's look at verse 6 if there's no other questions. We're going to read 6 through 11. And it says, in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travels went by roundabout ways. The peasantry ceased. They ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose. Until I arose, a mother in Israel. New gods were chosen. Then war was in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, the volunteers among the people. Bless the Lord. You who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who travel on the road, sing at the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering places. There they shall recount the righteous deeds of the Lord, the righteous deeds of his peasantry in Israel. Then the people of the Lord went down to the gates. Verse 6 through 11 is a section that tells us just how bad the political and spiritual condition was in Israel, as we look very closely at the language. Now, Shamgar, his antics, the things that he did, probably predated Deborah by at least a few years. Probably predated her judgeship. Jael was, of course, a contemporary. So Deborah seems to be saying that the northern idolatry and Jabin's oppression was going on for quite some time. Now, we know exactly how long it went on because it says that his oppression was 20 years. So the reason why I gave you just a little bit of an introduction to this section is, we could take it one way. I would say that probably when Deborah was just a little girl, Shamgar was doing those things in the south to the Philistines. And probably as a little girl, she heard all the stories because he was a legend. He used that old ox goad to get those wicked Philistines. So I'm sure he was a huge childhood favorite. And so, we're not too sure about the dates, obviously, but I have this idea that Deborah knew who Shamgar was, and that's why she's introducing him here. It says, in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and then she goes on. In other words, instead of saying a boring 20 years, basically it's song. So she's making it more colorful. So the days of Shamgar represent the days prior to, even before she was judges, maybe the days when she was a little girl. And we know that Jabin was up to his annex for 20 years, and then Deborah was sent up north. So Deborah was probably a little girl at the time that Jabin was starting his power and getting his power all together in the north, and he started to dominate the Israelites there. So anyway, so to me, that it's just another way of saying, for 20 years, just seems like a little bit more poetic. So things were so bad in the north during these 20 years that they couldn't even use the main roads to travel. They had to use the byways or the indirect paths for fear of being hassled or even attacked by the Canaanites, is what it's basically telling us. The people had no real leadership at this time, as the tribal leaders seemed to have simply capitulated and grew resigned to this new reality. Now, verse 7 continues to describe this desperate situation as peasants, or literally inhabitants of the villages, ceased, meaning this. That does not mean, see, if you take the normal natural words, especially in NASB, it's basically saying, you just take it at face value, it's saying that basically things were so good in Israel that there wasn't even any peasantry. It ceased, right? And then when Deborah, arose, all of a sudden the poor came back, right? So it's definitely, there's a problem here in the normal, natural reading of this. Using the phrase inhabitants of the villages and understanding the word cease, this meaning is that they had to flee behind fortified city walls in order to survive, thus leaving these places deserted. So the peasants or the villagers, the townsfolk, the regular townfolk in Israel at this time in the north were so hassled that they eventually just left their homes, and there was these deserted towns all over the place. That's what it means by that they ceased, because they had to go to the nearest fully Israelite city and hide behind the walls. And so that verse 7 continues the thought of verse 6. Then God came to the rescue, and he raised up Deborah, who became a mother in Israel. Now, we did spend extra time last week on the fact that there was a lack of male leadership at this time. It's one of the main concerns and one of the main problems that we get out of this song. There wasn't men stepping up. There was no leadership. They were capitulating. They were just resigned to their, fate here. And the people couldn't travel on the road from point A to point B because they'd be hassled. Maybe there's 900 chariots would be riding around the main highways. So, where are all the men? So God, whose hands are never tied, raised up Deborah. I think we get that. So in verse 8, as a result of all this trouble, they decided to do what? Well, let's choose new gods. They chose the gods of their oppressors. And instead of turning back to God, who led them out of Egypt, part of this was that they wanted to appease the Canaanites by giving in and essentially becoming more Canaanite. So, you can't beat them, join them, right? Serve their gods. Their gods are winning, so maybe they're better. Other gods they simply chose as a way to gain favor with those gods who were more gods of crops and weathers. A lot of the Canaanite gods were. They dealt in crop, weather, sun, moon, nature gods. You want more blessing? You need to choose other gods. So when war came, they were not ready. Now, the statement, not a shield or spear was seen, this does not necessarily mean that the northern tribes had no weapons, but rather, remember, this is a song, poetically, they had no desire or courage to fight, so the weapons were nowhere to be seen. They chose what they perceived as an easy route of truce instead of risk and sacrifice, ultimately, during this time. In verse 9, we have another reference by Deborah about the valiant warriors who let their hair grow. It says, my heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, the volunteers among the people, bless the Lord. This is another reference of the men in verse 2 who volunteered and let their hair grow, metaphorically. Thankfully, they answered the call from God. So verse 10, Deborah is calling 3 different classes of people to recognize and acknowledge God's deliverance. Now, these 3 classes are only poetically representative of all Hebrews, because you'll see the Hebrews did not have, at this point in time, a royalty. But those who ride on white donkeys represent the royal class. White donkeys are greatly prized because they are rare, thus they are for royalty. Now, I cannot verify it, but there are some who swear that Jesus was riding on a white donkey. And it incensed the Pharisees and Sadducees who understood only royals ride on those. I can't find in the Gospels anything reference to color, but very interesting. We can ask him when we get to heaven, I guess. Was that a white donkey? It does as well. But those who ride on white donkeys, white horses, they're rare. And because they're rarity, it's royal. Because they're rare, it's for royalty, right? So what color horse do you have? What color horse is our horse? We have dark horses. What do we ride on? We're not. I don't have a horse right now. When am I getting a horse? You got a car. My horse is going to be white, right? All right. White horses, white donkeys for royalty and greatly prized. Those who sit on rich carpets are kind of like the wealthy, the aristocracy. Second class, I guess, but only they could afford such things. And those who travel on the road are the third class or the commoners. So all of Israel, no matter what class, was to sing praises to the Lord, was the idea here in verse 10. So verse 11 is another, unfortunately, problematic verse where the Hebrew has been difficult to translate. The Hebrew word chatsats has been translated musicians. The King James Version translates it, if you have the King James Version, as archers, or those who divide, actually, in the NASB. So there's these musicians, archers, or those who divide, and then there's watering places mentioned, and then there's a recounting. Now, my NASB says this again: at the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering places, they shall recount the righteous deeds of the Lord. Actually, the CBJ, which is the Complete Jewish Bible, it actually should be the CJB. I mixed them up. All right, so you can correct that on there. It's the Complete Jewish Bible, CJB. So that actually has a really good translation. Their translation is more to what I think the point is. It says, louder than the sound of archers at the watering holes. You say, well, what does that mean? Archers at the watering holes are being loud? What could possibly be happening at the water holes? And I put, what can be more easily understood even today than the banter of soldiers after a battle at a bar, if one's available, right? So Deborah is giving us a picture of these archers as they have gathered to get water and are excitedly sharing war stories and battle scars, but with one caveat: they are giving glory to Jehovah, because in him they were given the victory. And that's the idea of the beginning of verse 11. And you could see it as he's, we're marching down Mount Tabor. We're looking at those 900 chariots. I had my arm cocked back, and I think I got a rider in sight. Man, I got them lined up, as they're telling these stories. Just before I could let it fly, I had this guy. Did you see that thunder and lightning? Did you hear that? Boom, boom, boom. Did you, as the sky opens up, did you see those guys? I just put my bow and arrow, over my shoulder and just ran right up. They started stick in the mud. Did you see all that? So they're recounting these war stories and what happened to them as they marched down Mount Tabor. I can imagine that. And so she is in song, given this visual as they recount what they saw during the battle as God gave them the victory. Now it says the righteous deeds of his peasantry. I don't have this in the notes. Then the people of the Lord went down to the gates. So basically the villagers that were once scattered, what happens at the gates? Does anybody know? What happens generally at this time at the city gates? They gather there for judging, trade, commerce, right? So basically what Deborah is saying is trade and commerce and all that began again because of this. Got it? So let's look at the next section. Any questions over the first 11 verses? How are we doing so far? Am I being clear, plain, concise? I hope. It's a lot. Extra time this week preparing. Okay, let's look at the next 7 verses. We're going to get the roll call, all right? And you should be able to kind of determine who's positive and who's not. It gives you a little idea here. It says, awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, sing a song. Arise, Barak, and take away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then survivors came down to the nobles. The people of the Lord came down to me as warriors. From Ephraim, those whose root is in Amalek came down, following you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, commanders came down, and from Zebulun, those who wield the staff of office. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As was Issachar, so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the piping for the flocks? Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Gilead remained across the Jordan. And why did Dan stay in ships? Asher sat at the seashore and remained by its landings. Zebulun was a people who despised their lives even to death, and Naphtali also on the high places of the field. So they call this the roll call of the tribes. And last week we learned that God called the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun to battle. And we find this week, through Deborah's song, that others joined as well. What I'm not sure about, honestly, I couldn't tell you, is when they volunteered. Was this after the Battle of Kishon? Now, I think the answer is yes, but again, I could be wrong, that there's nothing concrete. So the way I think this happened is Zebulun came down, right, with Naphtali. They fought the original battle, okay? And then they blew the shofar as they had Sisera defeated, and they now are going to conquer Jabin, and they have blown the shofar, and then the others then answered the call, all right? So it could have been that some of them joined. Deborah came from the area of Ephraim and Benjamin. Maybe she brought some soldiers with her. We don't know that. But here's the definite roll call. This is what she says in her song, so we know who each tribe did. So Ephraim sent volunteers. Now it says that Ephraim's root is in Amalek, and that has given people problems. I don't foresee that being much of a problem. It's not that there's Amalekites mixed in with Ephraim. It's impossible. It probably just means that most of Ephraim's territory, that purple strip right there, was all the Amalekites. That's where they originally held that land. So their root in Amalek means that's the territory they took it. They took it from the Amalekites. Benjamin sent volunteers. They actually followed Ephraim. As soon as Ephraim joined, Benjamin's south, just south of Ephraim. I don't know if you can see that. It's a little orange strip. They followed after Ephraim. Machir. Machir equal to Manasseh. Machir and Manasseh sent volunteers. Now, Machir is the only son of Manasseh. Now remember, Manasseh is a child of Joseph, right? He's the oldest. He was the one where Jacob went like that, right? Put his right hand on Ephraim, and you know Ephraim becomes the lead tribe. And Manasseh is the eldest. So Manasseh is the eldest son of Joseph. And Manasseh only had one son himself. And I tried to put this in the right way so you guys could understand. Because tribalism is based on clans and clan strength. Machir may have reached an almost equal status with his father, thus their names became kind of interchangeable. Do you guys understand what I mean? If you are 300 years down the road and you are from the tribe of Manasseh, you can trace your family line to Machir as easily as Manasseh, because Manasseh only had one son. So you all came from Manasseh, but you all came from Machir. I don't know what the deal was at this time, but for whatever reason, Machir was maybe such a strong leader that this tribe was known as Machir. So Machir is actually Manasseh. He's the first son of Manasseh. And for some reason, the names become interchangeable. I don't think there's a problem there. Zebulun was part of the original battle. They wield the staff of office, or Other versions say, hold the musterer's staff or hold the marshal's staff. King James Version says, Zebulun, they wield the pen of the writer. Actually, the King James Version seems to have the better translation here. Zebulun's staff was their pen, and not many could write during the time of the judges. So being able to write is actually that's why their reputation preceded them. Zebulun was known as a tribe of merchants. They were not scribes. So there's nothing in history that tells us that a lot of our scribes came from Zebulun. So what does that mean if they're not scribes, but they're merchants who could write? I think they were known to be merchants who were able to write down their own records, record their own books. And so what Deborah is saying about this is that even these merchants who were not trained in war, but really only in writing, you think of guys there with the glasses and just, sitting by a desk going like this. And even these men joined the war. They weren't trained in battle. They were trained in a pen. And they answered the call to arms. So that kind of is how I clear that up. I think that's a kind of a good translation there. But you'll find if you do enough research, they translate that phrase, and they're not really sure how that goes. But that seems to be the best way to translate that verse. So they were dorks, I guess, who wrote down their own records. Merchants. Made a lot of money, though. Issachar sent volunteers, verse 15. Naphtali sent volunteers, Barak's tribe, verse 18. Now Reuben. Reuben did not send volunteers, but rather stayed on the east side of the Jordan by the sheepfolds. Reuben is the pink square on the other side. Now, as we go over here, we start to travel over here. This is the east side of the Jordan. And there's 2.5 tribes there. Reuben, Gad, and the East Manasseh up at the top. Okay? You see that? So that's where Reuben's territory is. And she pictures them having these heartfelt discussions on whether to join this battle. And these discussions occurred by the divisions of Reuben, it says. Now, the Hebrew word pelagah is used here for division, but it is usually associated with rivers and streams. So a better translation is that these heartfelt discussions occurred among the brooks of Reuben. Reuben's territory was known for being well watered. So you picture these guys out there with the water in the background as they're determining, well, should we join or should we not join? I think that's what Deborah was giving them a jab there for not joining. They discussed it, but they decided against it. But there was heartfelt, discussions amongst Reuben. Now, Gilead is another name for Gad because the area in the purple there belonged to Gilead, which was a Canaanite people. And so they defeated that, and for whatever reason, that area became known as Gilead or Gad. They did not send volunteers and also lived on the east side of the Jordan. Dan did not send volunteers. Now, the tribe was almost certainly way up north in their new territory, which would actually be probably just off this map. Okay, that's how far north Dan went. They're really far up there. So I argue that Dan is there, but I do want to mention that if you look, do you see where Dan is? Can you see over there on the west side? It's just above Judah. So it's an orange strip, right? So we have a little bit of Benjamin, and then we have Dan running to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. Everybody see it, Dan? So Joppa is a very, very important seaport that's right in Dan's territory. So she could be referring to their ancient or original tribal territory. And so she's, even if they're not there, she's talking metaphorically about Dan staying in ships. But there may have been another reason. I have this down here. That it could have been that they had a known treaty with the Sidonians, who were ship makers. Sidonians, very powerful along the sea, right? So Dan got up there, and one of the reasons why they survived is they made peace. And one of them, a very, very strong allegiance, is with the Sidonians. So they may have aided the Sidonians in shipbuilding. So that may have been the reference as well. Getting involved in this war would have threatened their relationship with their neighbors. Asher didn't send volunteers and probably had the same treaties with the Phoenicians as Dan. You can see Asher's all the way up, right along the Mediterranean Sea, up at the top. And in their territory, we had Tyre. And there originally a lot of territory should have included Sidon, but they never conquered it. Never really conquered Tyre either. But that's where Asher is. So this would have messed up their merchant business, as Asher was right on the coast. Now, all this is brought up an important point that I made during my introduction in week 1. The division amongst the tribes along the north-south border, as well as the east-west Jordan River border, already existed 150 years during the time of the judges. We're 150 years in, and you can see these major divisions already. Remember when Joshua dismissed the one army in the book of Judges? Joshua. You remember the book of Joshua? He dismissed, and he let the 2.5 tribes, he let Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh go back to their territory. The one army is dismissed. Remember that? And the 2.5 tribes on the east side of Jordan built an altar before they crossed over to their allotment. Now, this should also tell us another big thing about the times, right? Do you remember why they were so upset that this altar was built? How many altars are allowed they're one. See, they knew, and they were strict at this time. There is only one authorized altar of burnt offering allowed in the land. And where does that exist? What's that? But not just right in front of the tabernacle, right? I mean, yes, you're being very exact, right? But generally, it's supposed to be in front of the tabernacle. So they knew there's only one designated, authorized altar allowed in the land. And so when these guys built this other altar, they flipped. As a matter of fact, they were ready to go to war. Now, does anybody remember why they built the altar? What was their explanation? Well, what do you think they thought was going to happen once they went and crossed over the Jordan? Yeah, they're going to be far away from the God of Israel, far away from their brothers, forgotten, left out, right? And this calmed the other tribes down because they understood. They built that altar because they were afraid that the other tribes would forget them and that they would lose their portion with Israel and their God. 150 years later, and they just couldn't be bothered because what happened to their brothers was just not their concern. You see this? It wasn't in their territory, so why should they care? Asher and Dan were right there amidst the trouble, but they had good relations that they were worried about spoiling. How about Judah and Simeon? Deborah didn't even bother mentioning or even criticizing them because at this time already, they were kind of like their own nation. The thought would never have crossed her mind to even invite them to this battle. Now, Israel was not a nation. We talked about that, and they certainly were showing it. Now, it's kind of interesting in the light of this chapter how things panned out for these tribes. The 2.5 tribes in the east of the Jordan were the first to be scattered and assimilated by Israel's enemies. They were the first to go. Dan gave up their allotted territory and really their God when they moved north, and they actually didn't last too long and ended up with a remnant in northern Africa. That's all we know about Dan. Somehow they ended up there. They just left. Finally, out of the lost 10 tribes, only Asher has not been found yet. But they will, just not yet. Now, that was as of 10 years ago, so I don't know if anybody has heard any news and notes. Have they found the tribe of Asher yet? I'm not sure. This is about news that I picked up from 10 years ago, so take it with a grain of salt. Maybe they found some Asherites somewhere. And that is the roll call. And I think it's very, very important that we understand the divisions, because these kind of divisions are really going to actually help you understand some areas in the book of Judges, some chapters that we're going to go over in the future. But it also can help you understand books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, which the people were very divided still during that time. Now look, what happened when David finally was made king? Was he made king of all Israel? No. As a matter of fact, he was made king for about 7.5 years in Hebron, which is in Judah, and the north hadn't decided on him yet. So finally, after 7.5 years, they decided to invite him. As a matter of fact, they probably had to talk the Benjamites into joining. Somehow they did, but the Benjamites never forgot. They blamed David. Well, how do we know that? Well, this is how, understanding these things and moving forward through the books, you can see these divisions and kind of pick things out. Absalom is going to take the city over, right? And David's leaving the city because he doesn't want to battle right there in the middle of Jerusalem. So David leaves. You remember that? Now he's leaving the city, and some guy is cursing him, saying all kinds of things. You get what you deserve. God is getting you back. Right? Pastor George, do you remember the guy's name? Shimei, yes. Shimei. Do you remember what his tribe was? Take a guess. Who had the most against David out of all the tribes? Benjamin, because, he stole the kingship. Even though Saul died in battle, and here you see these divisions. David's leaving the city. He didn't do anything against Benjamin, but they still had it against him. Now they're brothers, right? They should kiss and make up. They're all together. Come on, brother Benjamin, brother Judah. We're all brothers here, right? And unfortunately, you see this time and time again. When I was a young Bible student and I saw the division after Solomon, I thought that was the time they divided. Until I really read through and I understood the divisions were already there. They were not only there because they allowed them to occur, but there was a mountain range that ran right down the center of Israel that kind of divided Judah from the rest of the tribes. Then there's the natural barrier of the Jordan River that, for whatever reason, that just, separated those other tribes on the eastern side. And so these divisions were already there, already 150 years into the book of Judges. And this roll call right here shows us why, shows us or gives us an idea of what happened and why and what those divisions were. Everybody understand? We're good? Let's read verses 19 through 23. Everybody good to continue? The kings came and fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan. At Tanakh near the waters of Megiddo, they took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. O my soul, march on with strength. Then the horse's hooves beat from the dashing of his valiant steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord. Utterly curse its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord. To the help of the Lord against the warriors. Now, last week we did go over this section, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I did want to point out verse 20. It says that the stars fought from heaven. It obviously indicates, to me at least, that the heavenly intervention of God using the weather to claim the victory. All right? It could also indicate, and I don't know if anybody got this when they read through this, I don't know if you know what I'm going to say, but it also could indicate that there was a heavenly battle raging congruently amongst the angels, as they are often referred to as stars. So while the earthly battle was fought, a heavenly battle was fought as part of this angelic conflict. I don't know if anybody else picked that up or thought that. I'm not necessarily 100% sure, but that gives me the idea the stars fought from heaven, an idea of the angels. Whatever the case was, it was a heavenly battle as much as it was an earthly battle. And we know that obviously because the Lord manifested on that battlefield in a very large thunderstorm. But there was a heavenly one, apparently. I think it was more than just an earthly battle there. So we talked about how the Kishon flooded. We talked about the thunderstorm and how God used that torrent that flood that battlefield and stick all those chariots, right, stuck in the mud. And some of the torrent actually swept some of those chariots probably right on down the river as it overflowed. Now, in verse 23, a place called Meroz was cursed for not getting involved in the battle. And I'm sorry, usually I have an answer, but there are some guesses. Nobody really knows where it is or who they were at all. I have found nobody who has positively identified where this is even located. Now, what I can deduce, and I think you probably all deduced it with me, right, is that this town had, for whatever reason, had every reason to be involved in this fight. And that's a fact, right? Because they are the only town that is cursed. And it says that this town right here is cursed by the angel of the Lord himself. So we don't know where the town is, but this town had every reason to be involved, but you know what? They said no thanks. Maybe it was right in Naphtali's, maybe it was out of all, maybe there were so many volunteers in Naphtali, and it was the city in Naphtali, and it was the one that just, they with the rest, they wouldn't go with the rest of their brothers. I don't know. But I don't have answers for you in case you were wondering where that was. All right, let's finish up in verses 24 through 31. Follow along with me. Any questions so far? 24. Most blessed of women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she of women in the tent. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a magnificent bowl, she brought him curds. She reached out her hand for the tent peg and her right hand for the workman's hammer. Then she struck Sisera. She smashed his head, and she shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he bowed. He lay. He fell. He lay. Between her feet he bowed. He fell. Where he bowed, there he fell dead. Out of the window she looked and lamented, the mother of Sisera, through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoofbeats of his chariots tarry? Her wise princesses would answer her. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. Are they not finding, or are they dividing the spoil? A maiden, 2 maidens for every warrior. To Sisera, a spoil of dyed work, a spoil of dyed work embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoiler. Or on the neck of the spoiler? Sorry, it's a question. Thus, let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years. So verses 24 through 27, we have a rather poetic and graphic retelling of how Jael ended Sisera's life with a tent peg. Jael, who wasn't Hebrew, is getting plenty of praise here from Deborah. Now, when I read this, I was wondering whether this was part of Barak's lost honor, right? Here is part of the song that should have concluded with him sending Sisera to his God, or some verbiage that way, some poetic writing of Barak's triumph. But yet here we were ending this song pretty much as, and Jael is a big part of it. So, although I highly doubt that he would have used a tent peg instead, he is left out in the place of Joel. So in verses 28 through 31, the song shifts to the home of Sisera, where his mother expectingly waits for his triumphant return. Why shouldn't she? She's been doing this for 20 years. Obviously, this is a song, so there may or may not have been a literal mother waiting for Sisera. And the other thing, you have to admit that this section is a little dark when you guys read it. But I want to follow this to his ultimate conclusion. I think I read somewhere that said, women are a little bit different than men. They can be a little vicious, right? When in retaliation. I don't want to go that far. It's just a little dark here as Deborah writes this piece. So the idea here is Sisera's mother is waiting for this victory parade with her son at its head, mounted on his iron chariot. But he should have been back by now. Where could he be? Because she is part of the elite, being the mother of a general, her servants and ladies in waiting surround her. In verse 29, they try to cheer her up by telling her that it must be all the booty that they are dividing. Now, unfortunately, in verse 30, where it says, a maiden, two maidens, right? Everybody see that? Verse 30, a maiden, two maidens for every warrior. The Hebrew word is rehem, or rechem, and it actually means womb. You understand? So it should read, a womb, two wombs for every warrior. The practice of taking women as part of war booty is disgusting, but it is obviously nothing new. It is an ancient practice to take women of the enemy and use them for sexual gratification or even brought home for the rest of their lives. This behavior was so reprehensible that God forbid Israelite soldiers to practice this. They were not allowed to do this. It's forbidden. Ultimately, Sisera is not taking spoils, is he? As his mother is recounting all the spoils that Sisera, his son, should be taking. And he's dead. The song ends in verse 31 with two petitions. Now, the first is that God would destroy all of his enemies just as thoroughly as he did at the Kishon. The second is a sort of prayer. It's a little bit more of a prayer. So Deborah's going to end this in prayerful fashion, and she's saying a prayer for those who love God, like the men who let their hair grow, that they be seen as glorious as the rising sun. Then when all these battles were over, the land rested for 40 years. The question that I was asked about was, why does it say, thus let your enemies perish, O Lord? And then it says, but let those who love him be like the rising sun. I think that the switch from going to you, right, to him is because of the type of prayer right at the end. Were you going to say something, Pastor George?
Got a question from online.
Uh-oh.
DJ's asking, could the milk have been to make Sisera sleepy?
Yeah, absolutely possible, right? Right, so the question was milk given to him to make him sleepy? And we know that history shows, right, tells us that, warm milk before bedtime, right, and it's a remedy for, insomnia and other, right? So, yeah, I would say that it says right here, right, that he asked for water, and she gave him milk instead. So she was willing him to sleep. Yes, I'll give you some milk, some warm milk. That's well put. I think last week I might have mentioned that, but yeah, definitely the use of milk here is a little sinister, I think. Any other questions?
He said that Debbie was slick.
She was slick. And last week I was calling Joel by accident. And I told him I apologize. I wasn't trying to give her any ideas. So I don't know if I answered the last part because it was a question actually that DJ asked, but I think it's because of the prose that she's using here. The last section right there is a praise and a prayer for the men who didn't cut their hair, those men who went out to battle. And it's a prayer to the Lord. Now, at the end, I just put a couple things, and we'll wrap up, for those who let their hair grow. Now, remember that these events started when a group of men and women from Naphtali and Zebulun humbled themselves and prayed. They cried out to the Lord in repentance and humility. God heard their prayers and rescued his people. That's how this whole thing started. Really typical of what's going on. It's really fitting, I should say. Not typical. It's fitting for what's going on with us today. As we probably, the best thing we can do right now is cry out to the Lord and ask him to save our country. You ask the Lord to come fight for you, and he will. 2 Chronicles 20:17. You need not fight this battle. Take your position. Stand and watch the salvation of the Lord on your behalf, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear or be dismayed. Tomorrow, go out and face them, for the Lord is with you. Psalm 34:17. The righteous cry out. The Lord hears and rescues them from all their troubles. Deuteronomy 3:22. Do not fear them, for the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. And Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Joan. Sure. If you have any questions, ask them. Fine. I'll field some questions. No. There is one enemy, Jabin, who is the king up in a city called Hatzor. Okay? We talked about last week. And Jabin doesn't just rule that city. He has a group of cities that he is king of. And so this is a large group that is up there and in very, very north, right around the Sea of Galilee area. And the king he ruled that area for 20 years. So I won't want you to think of it as one king in one city. I think he had a group of cities that were allied with him, that he controlled. No, Jabin was a Canaanite king. He was not Jewish. Right. God sent Jabin, rose him up, gave him power for 20 years to teach the northern tribes a lesson, to punish, to discipline them for their idolatry. And so all these tribes that we discussed are Israelites. Some went and fought and were part of this battle and in defeating Jabin completely, and others sat on the sidelines and watched. Well, yes, the problem was that they were worshiping other gods. They chose new gods. Remember that verse? Verse 8. They just chose new gods. Life became difficult, and they thought, well, that God looks good. Right. We choose new gods all the time. So Joan was asking about, who was on whose side and the battle, so just clearing that up about Hatzor and Jabin and the tribes. All right, any other questions? That is true, right? The mother connection. Annabelle brought out that she was a mother in Israel. Deborah was a mother in Israel. And then she speaks about Sisera's mother. And you got that connection. Very good.
I was thinking the same thing. There's three different women in this whole scene here. And we see Deborah, who is a prophetess.
Right.
So she's one who's seen and known by everyone, pretty much, right? And she sat under the tree resting, and they would come to her for judging. So it seems, I was just thinking about how God uses women in various ways and in different roles. Because she was used, publicly. She was used to encourage and call forth and inspire the men to do what God wanted them to do.
Right.
And then you see Jael, who's actually a great contrast to Mirage, because the angel of the Lord said he did not come. But you see Jael, who is a wife. Deborah's the mother.
Right. He's a Kenite. She's not even a Hebrew.
That mother's heart, she wants the children of the Lord saved, right?
Right, yeah, she's,
God uses in that place. And then, of course, you see his mother, Sisera's mother, who's wails because she encouraged her son to do these things
right.
and was waiting for him to come home in victory. And yet she wailed.
It was all about their God. It was all about the spoils. It was about that victory. And
It could be the role God wants
right,
you to be, or you can choose the way of the world. And
very good.
there's a lot of spiritual things.
I'm not going to repeat that for those who are watching at home, but there's 3 women in the chapter. Read it yourself. Pick out the 3 women and come up with your own thoughts. Mary had a lot of good thoughts. The 3 women of Judges chapter 5. It could be another study. Let's look at the 3 women of Judges chapter 5. Well, I've kept you for quite some time. It's a little bit late, so let's close in the word of prayer and thank the Lord for his word. Are you sure there's no other questions from anybody tonight? Well, I hope you were blessed by tonight's study as I was. Thank you for your kind attention. God's word is wonderful. And so there's always things that we can learn and just new views of things, new ways of looking at things once we go through the word in different books, you know. I mean, Judges offer perspective of things, you know. And so I've been blessed by studying it. It's been great. Well, dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for tonight. Just thank you for Judges chapter 5, what we learned from the Song of Deborah, from your word. I just continue to pray for those who are at home, those who come out here every Thursday night, that this will be a study that really blesses them, really strengthens their faith and their walk with you. And that's why we're here learning these things, so we can walk with you, that we're not going to be disturbed by the things that are going on in our world, because this is not the first time in human history some really bad things have occurred, and your people have been, involved and been in sometimes the firing range, been held under the fire and had to deal with a whole lot of difficulty. So I just pray that you encourage each one as they drive home tonight and throughout the week, remembering these things we studied. Again, seeing how you came alive, how you came around, how you just stepped in and fought for your people when they cried out to you and they humbled themselves and they looked towards you for the victory. And you gave them that victory, Lord. And so may we be humbled tonight as well to just look to you for the victories, no matter what goes on in the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, next couple of years, Lord. We're totally dependent on you to win the battle and have the victory for us. So we pray all this, Lord, and thank you again for your word, that we have the freedom still to study it. And we just thank you and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.